Jared Genzer, a human rights attorney and pro bono counsel for the family of Siamak Namazi.
What I do every day is working for very vulnerable people in the UK and around the world. None of us who do that work for ourselves. We do it for our clients.
Jim Foley was an American journalist covering the war. When he was kidnapped by ISIS terrorists in 2012, his mother, Diane Foley, tells Jim's story and how she came to be a leading advocate for Americans held hostage abroad.
We must have accountability. We must have justice.
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark Stevens, I'm moderating today for you. As the world slides from even the pretense, perhaps, of democracy into autocracy and without even a backward glance towards the rule of law, the plight of political prisoners, I think, is becoming ever more stark. We have some of the most prodigiously experienced people with us to share their insights and experience. I think all of them would prefer not to have that experience and knowledge, but they do. And we've got Diane Foley, author of American Mother and founder of the James Foley Legacy Foundation to advocate for freedom for innocent Americans held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad, as well as two world-renowned colleagues who you saw in the opening there, Keelan Gallagher, King's Counsel from London, and Jared Genzer, who've both done amazing work to get those held by authoritarian regimes released. Today, I'm going to start by hopefully talking about some of the problems, but quite briefly, because I'd like to get to a discussion amongst our panelists, who I've told to be very rude and interrupt one another, in the hope that we can perhaps start to go towards solutions, because it seems to me that that's the more positive way for this. So Diane, I would like to start with you. This is, of course, an issue deeply personal for you. Your son Jim was captured in 2011 in Libya by Gaddafi loyalists and held there for 44 days, and then he was held hostage by the Islamic State and held for another 21 months, during which you scrambled to secure his freedom. Could you really tell us, if you can, what that experience was like, but also perhaps peculiarly focused on what you think went well and what went less well, and hopefully we can use that to table set for folks?
Sure. First of all, I was incredibly ignorant about the dangers of being a freelance journalist out in the world. Our oldest son was covering the conflict. His last country he was in was Syria when he was taken by the ISIS jihadists. But I was also ignorant about how our government went about. I kind of assumed our government had the back of innocent Americans when they were out in the world, if you will. And so the first time when Jim was taken, it was very short, and actually it was through a friend of a friend who did some research and found someone connected to one of Gaddafi's sons, and that's how Jim got out from Libya, really. It was literally a young woman from Vermont who knew one of Gaddafi's sons and was willing to intercede on his behalf. Second time, nobody had any idea who had taken Jim. And our government, I really feel I trusted our government. You know, they kept telling me Jim's our highest priority. And but as the months went by, Jim was taken in 2012, Thanksgiving of 2012. As the months went by, nothing seemed to be happening, particularly when all the European hostages slowly started to come home. Jim had been taken with 18 to 20 other hostages, all from Western countries. And starting in January of 2014, all the European hostages were negotiated out and came home. And then I started to realize, boy, our country isn't negotiating, you know.
Was that a surprise to you?
Absolutely, because we'd been told that Jim was our country's highest priority. But as it got closer in 2014, we were also threatened with prosecution if we dared try to gather a ransom for Jim's release. It was really appalling how we were treated. And after he had been held for 18 months, I began to realize it was time we had to try to raise a ransom ourselves and take it into our own hands. But it was much too late. And so when Jim was brutally beheaded in such a public, horrific way, after being incredibly shocked, I, was angry, not just at the captors, but also at our government, because I had felt that our country could do better than that. I really felt like I had been lied to. If our country had just been honest, we can't help you, or we just don't know. We have no one who's accountable, and that was the reality. There was no one in our government whose job it was to help us, really. So the poor people I spoke to didn't know what to do with me, frankly. So that's when we started the James Foley Legacy Foundation. It just feeling we have to be able to do better. We have to. And it wasn't just Jim who was killed, but Kayla Mueller, Stephen Sotloff, Peter Kasich, and 3 other Americans in that time frame. So President Obama got a lot of pressure to do something. And so thankfully, that's when he did a review of what we called our hostage policy and started our U.S. hostage enterprise, which has, now in the last 10 years has brought home more than 122.
So someone actually seized with this responsibility?
Yes, absolutely.
And is that universal? Is all the governments doing that?
No. And that's why, no, not at all.
I did know the answer to that question, just in case.
And we have still our challenges, for sure. It's far from perfect. But we have had an outstanding presidential envoy for hostage affairs who was first given that job during the Trump administration and is still doing the job. So he's really very knowledgeable and incredibly talented.
Sounds quite bipartisan, which is good.
Yes.
General, can I come to you? Saw you in the video, saw the sort of work you do. If you had to sort of pick a trend, what sort of trend do you think we're seeing with hostages and political prisoners these days?
Yeah, so I would first provide a basic definition of a political prisoner, which I would distinguish necessarily from being a hostage, although a hostage could also be a political prisoner. But a hostage is a person who's detained, in essence, for something of value from whoever is holding them, whether it be a terrorist group, a criminal syndicate, or a government. A political prisoner is a person who, in essence, is detained for who they are, what they believe, who neither use nor advocate violence. I've worked on both kinds of cases over my career, and
what do you think are the big trends that we're going?
Yeah, I think the most worrying trend is the way in which authoritarian regimes have really gone up what's been referred to as William Dobson's book says, the dictator's learning curve. Authoritarian regimes are sharing effective practices for detaining political prisoners and deflecting attention from them. And so dictators are getting much smarter in terms of not charging people with overtly political crimes, but manufacturing crimes like financial crimes or other kinds of items that are harder to figure out. They're also imprisoning people in certain cases for shorter prison terms. And I found it's very hard to mobilize global outrage if a person gets a 2-year sentence, right? And so we have to respond in kind, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a lot more on this panel, but we have to up our game. I think the world of people like Keelan and myself who work on these kinds of cases is growing, but we're not even close to where we need to be in terms of resources.
Just give us a little insight, if you would, into the dynamics of how this is changing. So this seems to me almost like asymmetric conflict, in the sense that they're changing their playbook, they're learning from one another. What's happening at our end?
Yeah. Well, I think the exciting part is that these days there's been a much greater recognition by governments and multilateral organizations that the imprisonment of political prisoners is an actual serious and real issue. It's always very hard to get political prisoners as a higher priority given competing national interests in bilateral and multilateral relationships. But we have come a long way. And today I would say, I've worked 50 cases over my career. And I'd say that, when I start out on any given case, there are probably about 100 options of things that I could consider doing, from incredibly impactful to less meaningful. But it's all about, learning how to effectively, as Keelan has done so incredibly in her career and others as well, how do you combine the legal, the political, and the public relations advocacy actions to get someone out? And the most important insight I would say as a lawyer that I have is that people don't get out accidentally because human rights groups or governments are calling for their release. You need a strategy up front that goes right to the heart of compelling the dictatorship to release the political prisoner.
And is that a playbook that you develop for yourself, or do you think it's different in each case?
So, I mean, there are a lot of standard aspects of it, and then it's specialized for each case.
Yeah. Keelan, for you, you're doing a lot of this too. So what are the trends that you're discerning at the moment?
Sure, and I completely agree with Jared on the points that he's made, including about the use of short sentences. I'm increasingly seeing the use of remand as a long-term way to kind of quell critical voices, which it causes particular difficulties. But I suppose if I had to pick one trend, the main thing I would pick is that authoritarian regimes are becoming increasingly creative in how they target their critics, whether they're trade unionists, journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers. And really, we see that in two main ways. The first is more creative use of the law, and the second is more creative use of how you actually capture the political prisoner, wherever in the world they are. So on the law, we're seeing a whole range of different types of laws being weaponized to try to target those who speak truth to power in any way. So instead of just using traditional legal weapons like defamation or criminal libel or even terrorism laws, increasingly now what we're seeing is people facing things like, for example, a charge related to intellectual property, copyright, or harassment, or in completely different fields. I'll give you one example. In 2018, when the Turkish lira was in free fall, you had a whole series of reporters who reported on that, and you then had them being charged under the Capital Markets Act. And 33 people, including 2 Bloomberg reporters, were charged and threatened with jail sentences simply for reporting on the economic reality of what was happening to a currency. So that's an example.
But so it's a completely true story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, look, you know, what I see quite often, we have Sebastian Lai sitting here in the audience and Jose Zamora, and their fathers are both journalists, political prisoners targeted because of speaking truth to power, and their fathers have faced being called fraudsters, dishonest. Maria Ressa, my client in the Philippines, who won the Nobel Peace Prize a number of years ago, again called a tax evader, and that's something we're increasingly seeing. Yeah. But could I also just mention on the more creative use of how to actually capture prisoners? This is a key issue. Increasingly, we're now seeing transnational ways of authoritarian regimes reaching out to capture people and make them political prisoners, even if they've sought haven abroad. Now, we all, of course, know some of the very high-profile examples of states doing that. Jamal Khashoggi, for example, the Washington Post journalist. But we're seeing it in a really wide range of ways. So a journalist, for example, being captured through a Ryanair plane, being literally captured in the air and brought into jurisdiction in Belarus. That's one example. Paul Rusesabagina, the Hotel Rwanda hero, lured to a false meeting and captured and put on a private plane in UAE in order to be brought back to Rwanda and held as a political prisoner there. Or Ruhollah Azam, a journalist in France, similar situation, in exile in France, a refugee in France, and because of his work, the Iranian regime lured him to a false meeting with a source, captured him, returned him to Iran, where he'd been sentenced in his absence to death, and they killed him. So that's an increasing trend we're now seeing. States using the long arm of the state to try to reach out, to get political prisoners brought into their jurisdiction wherever in the world they may be.
One of the things I'm really interested in has come out of all of the contributions that you've made is essentially this idea of criminalizing people and the use of the rule of law, but also, interestingly, the use of illegality, like extraordinary rendition or, essentially abduction and those kinds of things.
And if I could just interject on one narrow point here to build on what Keelan was saying, we're also seeing a much larger number of abusive red notices from Interpol being sought based on bogus charges that are sent to Interpol. And in essence, in a first round review, if it's a diffusion case where it's like a state asking other states to help, you can get a red notice really without any review by Interpol at all. And to get a person off of a red notice who's being sought abroad, and I have a number of clients in those situations right now, it can take 9 months to a year or longer. And meanwhile, the red notice is out there, and sometimes it's reported publicly, which can have huge consequences for dissidents and so forth. So, I mean, we also are seeing a weaponization of institutions as well.
Yeah, I think this is a really important build, and thank you for that, Jared. So one of the things I'm interested in is perhaps disaggregating this a little bit, because it seems to me, on the one hand, you've got the misuse of the rule of law, the abuse of the rule of law, if you like, and on the other hand, you've got ignoring the abuse of law, misuse of law, and the rule of law not applying at all in the case of abductions. So let's just focus on the legal side of it at the moment. I said in my opening remarks, anticipating we would get to this point, is that, you know, we seem to be sliding into autocracy and the rule of law. So if somebody is taken using these, if you like, bogus charges or the attempt to criminalize them, can you rely on the rule of law to help them, to get them out?
So short answer, no, within the individual country. If you're dealing with a country, a state which is not rule of law compliant, you have to have a system which is law plus, because just relying on domestic laws within that country won't work. I've got a very practical example. I act for an Iranian rapper, Tumaj Salehi, who was sentenced to death for a song. So sentenced to death for his music, for his words. Some of you may have seen the coverage this week when we got the death sentence overturned in Iran, but he remains in prison. Now, we recognised in that case, as in all the cases that Jared and I do, and others in the room who've worked on these cases know, and all the cases that you support, Diane, if you're dealing with a state like Iran, it is not rule of law compliant. They don't play by the rules. And you need to work out a way. You've got to have a strategy to work out what is the off-ramp for them, the face-saving way through, if they need a face-saving way through, and how can you use international legal pressure, but also international political and other pressure in order to ensure that they do the right thing for the wrong reasons. We, of course, would like to be dealing with states who do the right thing for the right reasons, but unfortunately many of the states we deal with won't do the right thing for the right reasons. You've got to work out what the leverage is to make them do the right thing and to rescue your client, to rescue the political prisoner for another reason.
Let me give an example of exactly what Keelan is talking about. I represented a guy named Jason Puracal, who was a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Nicaragua, met a local woman, got married, settled down, and was buying and selling property, running the Remax affiliate there. And he got grabbed one day out of nowhere with like 24 guys in riot gear breaking into his office and taking him into custody. And he was charged and convicted of drug trafficking, organized crime, and money laundering. He was totally innocent of all these charges. We had a DEA agent for Latin America say he has nothing to do with all this. But you know, the first inclination was Daniel Ortega is the president of Nicaragua. This must be an intentional move on his part, right? And but I always want to test those hypotheses, because it turns out in this particular case where we hired a former intelligence operative from a global intelligence service to help us, what we learned actually was that the reason he was grabbed had nothing to do with him at all, but that they were trying to disqualify a guy running for mayor in that little town, and he was arrested along with my client. And Ortega was actually upset at the local Sandinista party because because they basically created a new fight with the United States he didn't want. And so while lots of people were telling me we need to go after Ortega and call him out and attack him, in that particular case, after winning his case at the UN, finding he was being held illegally, we actually went to members of Congress who were kind of shocked by the letter that we had prepared, saying to Ortega, you know, very gently and softly, please take a fresh look at the case, et cetera, because we had heard from someone in the president's office that if Ortega got such a letter that was not attacking him but was asking for his help, that could be the excuse to go to the local party and get this case resolved. And that's ultimately what happened. But knowing the dictator and their thinking, knowing exactly why your client has been detained, is like the very first step in any process to be able to do things well. People often think as a human rights lawyer that, you know, you're all name and shame, yelling and screaming from the rooftops. As a human rights lawyer like Keelan, I'm tactically neutral. So if I can get a client out of jail without going public with the case, and that is the more effective approach, I will always choose to do that. You only go public when you've exhausted potential private remedies.
And Keelan, how significant is this quiet diplomacy, if you like? Not because most people in the room will think who are the good guys and who are the bad guys globally, and that sort of realpolitik that Gerard was talking about.
Well, this is such a lawyer answer, but it's true. It depends. And
well, it depends on what?
Well, so I'll give you a couple of contrasting examples. I mean, sometimes you have a situation where actually backroom diplomacy is going to be much, much more effective. And a good example of that is where, for example, I've got a number of clients who are business people where their story is not particularly interesting in the same way that a rapper is interesting or a journalist, for example. And if you go public, it may be not hugely impactful. And then you've played your hand about going public, and actually you undermine yourself strategically. So in those cases, often it's much better to think about the dagger on the wall in the play for Act 2 and make them worried about what you're going to do. So instead what you do is try to build up the pressure to show them what might come their way if you do go public. And backroom diplomacy can be very helpful there. I mean, in Iran, last number of years, I've got 13 people out. 5 of them are cases no one's heard of at all. The others are all public in some way. And in all of those, backroom diplomacy works really well. So even with the same country, different things can work well. But sometimes being public and loud very quickly can be really effective. And one example of that is in Iraq. Iraq has started in the last year in particular weaponizing an old 1969 law which makes it a crime to publicly insult a public official. And it's now being used as a weapon to round up a whole series of critics of the government. And it happened to one of my clients, an Irish national who is based in Dublin, had travelled just to see a family member for a very short trip. He's an anti-corruption activist, very well known. He got picked up, and actually we worked out very quickly that this was essentially an exercise by Iraq in reputation management. And being public about the case loudly, quickly, was likely to give us an off-ramp at a very early stage in the case. Because in Iraq, if you let cases get past the first 7 to 10 days, it gets much, much harder to get the prisoner out. So we had a very small window and we had to go loud. And we had a couple of key pieces of leverage immediately. Iraq at the time was trying to get a seat on the Human Rights Council at the United Nations, and helpfully the Human Rights Council was sitting in Geneva. So we immediately got onto some of the UN Special Rapporteurs, got some public statements, made it public that we were going to Geneva and we were calling the case out, engaged a number of governments, but also Iraq was trying to open an embassy in Dublin. So we got the Irish government to take action extremely quickly, and we got him out in 8 days and got him home to his family, where of course he should have been. But that's an example where we couldn't wait. Waiting would have been the wrong thing to do. The window we had in that case meant we had to be public, we had to be loud, we had to do it fast. That was our leverage.
Can I just bring Diane in here? One of the things I'm really interested in is this quiet versus public. And this is clearly an issue that you had in Jim's and other cases. And what do you do? How do you work out whether, because it seems to me whether you're in Britain or America or indeed anywhere else, the government always wants you to shut up because you could cut across their foreign policy and interests.
Absolutely. It's tough, and it is individual. I've got to applaud Jared and Keelan because they're so right. The sooner you can act on a case, the better. And in that case, you can do it quietly, backroom, always better. Because the problem with going public, like with Jim and even with Evan Gershkovich and such, is that can raise the value of that prisoner in the eyes of the captors. And I think that's what happened with Jim, to be honest, when they and the other Americans and Brits, when they realized, our countries weren't going to negotiate. Our countries would not engage. Then we'll use them for propaganda. So they found a way to use them because people knew of them. So it's always a problem with families trying to decide, and a lot of families will try to be quiet in the beginning, but if they don't have the skill, there aren't many wonderful attorneys like Keelan and Jared here. We're always looking for pro bono attorneys that can help strategize with families.
Can I say they charge quite well?
I don't.
They do it all pro bono, and that's what's amazing. And slowly we're gathering, but it requires an amazing commitment. I mean, these attorneys commit to a family for years until that loved one comes home. So it's a huge commitment, but...
Let me just interject, it's just one illustration. In the Amazi case, Siamak and Bakr
exactly.
and Amazi, you saw. Siamak was detained in 2015, was the only American left behind in the hostage deal in 2016 along with the nuclear deal. Secretary Kerry said, he'd be out within weeks, and instead the dad got grabbed, and I ended up working on their cases for 7 years. And of course I had no idea how long it was going to be when I got started. That ended up being about a 2,000-hour plus pro bono case. Babak Namazi came to Washington, this is the brother/son, to advocate and advocacy around the world. We had 16 trips we took around the world, all with 3 or 4 days of meetings. At the end of this, we calculated it. We did 800 meetings over the course of 7 years, basically, all around the world, and thousands, hundreds, almost 1,000 media interviews as well. And that was just on 2 people's cases to get them out. And so as a lawyer pro bono, when I get involved in a case, I don't really know what I'm getting myself into, but it can end up becoming, an extraordinarily challenging endeavor.
And that's, go ahead, excuse me, Mark. All I was going to say, and that's where our governments need to take the lead. I think the Western community as a whole needs to really come together and say that this is our moral duty, if you will, for folks who are trying to establish democracy and justice and free press.
So what do you think are the sort of answers to this? I mean, I know that you've really moved the dial here in America. I think Europe plus Britain are pretty laggardly in comparison. So what is it that you think that people ought to be thinking about and about how to move the dial on these issues?
Well, I think the UN has made some steps. I think Canada, in their declaration against arbitrary detention at Oslo, Freedom Forum recently, they talked about a coalition. Again, it's how do we build that consensus in Western nations so we realize what a national security threat it is if we don't work together.
Let me just mention, I proposed something in the Wall Street Journal 2 years ago, and have been able to talk to senior U.S. government officials about it, and they are working on something along these lines. But my view, and this is on especially the question of hostage taking and hostages from around the world, my view is that regimes like Iran or China and others are really good at dividing and conquering. If they can't make a deal today with the U.S., they'll make one with the U.K. or they'll make one with China. What we need is multilateral engagement. And while the Canadian Declaration was lovely, it has no practical impact or effect. And so I proposed the idea of a multilateral agreement that President Biden could, for example, lead, that would bring together 50 or 70 countries that have had these problems over the years. And the idea would be a NATO-like attack on one is an attack on all approach. And if one hostage is taken, I proposed about 15 different options that could be done individually and collectively in the sovereignty of each country, deciding whether to collaborate. But if one country asks for help from the other signatories, they could work with that country to do any of 15 things. And if there's a pattern and practice of hostage taking, I propose another 20 action items that could be taken collectively. Because what we really need, especially in the hostage cases, is deterrence. And the reason why hostages keep getting taken is because we are consistently inconsistent with our approach. We don't make deals except when we do. And the bottom line is that every single hostage that's been taken by Iran, they profit from. And you have to disrupt that at the source. Once a hostage has been taken, you're going to have to cut a deal, and it's going to be horrible and disgusting to kind of do that, so.
Yeah, because I think a number of the states we're talking about are very nakedly transactional. So Iran will quite often say, we've taken this person, for example, we want this prisoner to be freed in another country. Russia will behave in that way too. I think it's more complex when you're dealing with some other states that have taken a huge number of political prisoners. I'll just give you one example. Hong Kong, and I wanted to come back to the point about rule of law earlier. Hong Kong has seen an absolutely huge exponential rise in the number of political prisoners. So this month, in June 2019, 5 years ago, there were 48 political prisoners in Hong Kong. And the most recent figures available are from April this year, 1,841. Now that's a rise of 7,000% in a 5-year period. But Hong Kong prides itself on being a rule of law compliant place, a place where it's safe to do business and so on. Many of you who were at the China panel earlier will have heard the presentation about China being a safe place to do business. Now, actually there, it's not just about leverage in individual cases. Actually, the leverage that we've got and that states have all got is showing the lie behind the position, suggesting that it's business as usual in Hong Kong. And we haven't seen a coordinated approach on that. And that's why we have a situation where you've got some emblematic cases like the most high-profile prisoner, Jimmy Lai, Sebastian's father, and Sebastian and Jose and Diane, of course, being members of the club no one wants to be in, simply thrown into this situation because of what's happened. But there are thousands of people who are being affected in this way in states who do care about their reputation, and where actually the leverage that we've got doesn't necessarily involve an individual family having to speak out. It involves holding them to account for undermining the rule of law and ensuring that we do not do business with them while they continue to behave in that way, and they feel in their pocket what the impact is. And Jared, on your point, and we've spoken about this before, I tend to see in a number of countries a real problem with siloing, where even when they raise an issue about a political prisoner or a hostage, it's raised only as a human rights fringe issue within their foreign ministry, for example. But in the meantime, they don't treat it as a home affairs issue, even when there's an international, transnational repression aspect. But they also don't treat it as a trade issue. Now, Apologies. So Maria Ressa's case, for example, key strategy for us in Maria Ressa's case, a US national being targeted because of being a journalist, not currently in prison, I'm pleased to say, but has a 6-year sentence hanging over her head. A key strategy there has been focusing on the European Union, one of the Philippines' main trade partners, and the Philippines and the EU have got a system where if the Philippines is compliant with a whole series of human rights standards, they get preferential trade arrangements. It's called the GSP Plus scheme. Very boring acronym, really important. And actually what was hugely important in Maria's case was the European Union over a consistent period of time saying, as long as you are treating Maria Ressa in this way, you're treating someone like Senator Leila de Lima in the way that you are for being a pro-democracy advocate and a pro-human rights advocate, we are not going to be able to maintain this system of trade preferences. And often, where the leverage is not in the individual case, it's on a macro scale, and it's about money.
It's really interesting you say this, and I do hold that thought because we're coming to audience in a minute. But I think one of the things that we're addressing here is essentially the failure of diplomacy in some ways and using other devices which are going to have an impact. Jared, are you seeing those as sort of examples? If you look at Hong Kong, I was interested to note that the US have titrated up their business risk advisory state, but the British haven't. And that can only be a political reason because either it is more dangerous to do business there or it's not.
Yeah, and I think that, again, this comes back to the need for like-minded
multinational
countries to work collaboratively with each other. We've seen more trends towards on individual targeted sanctions, for example, coming out of OFAC in the US and from the UK, the EU, and so forth. Much more coordination and sharing of information across those different agencies, which until relatively recently have been doing very little sharing of information. Mm-hmm. And you see the rolling out of sanctions against a particular country on democracy, human rights related matters, all happening on the same day at the same time. That has a much, much bigger effect. I mean, what I've found is that the sequencing of the activities that you do has a gigantic impact on your success or failure. So if you take a case and win at the UN, if you have an op-ed in the Washington Post and you do a press conference with some members of Congress, if you do that like once a month over 3 months, each of those 3 different things, there's a certain level of focus of the country and they see it, but you actually want to time it to happen on the same day, and I've done this now a number of times with cases that have connections to Washington, where you literally win the case at the UN, you're out with a press release, your op-ed at the Washington Post happens that day, and several hours later you do the press conference on Capitol Hill. And then I can assure you that the rogue state in question is paying very close attention.
But how do you Keelan, how do you amplify that on an international basis?
Yeah.
So, one of the challenges I think we're revealing here through your insights is that national state diplomacy isn't going to cut it. So where do you go next?
So 2 different things. First of all, I want to make a point about states, just picking up on what's been said, but I then also want to talk about some other really important actors here, which is the business community, and ways in which we can target actors who aren't only states, and what more could be done on that space. So on the state side, I think we're all agreed here that we've got to see a much more coordinated approach. All too often what I see when I have a prisoner who's detained in a particular country is you engage with their home state if they've got dual nationality or if they live somewhere else, for example, and it's a blank sheet of paper. And you're getting them to start, and you, as the lawyer or the family, are the people coming up with the ideas because the state has no strategy. I appreciate there's huge problems within the US system. I'm not suggesting it's perfect, but the presidential envoy, who Diane mentioned earlier, and I'm afraid I wanted to applaud during her speech when she was talking about the change she secured. I'm going to do it right now anyway, because what this woman has done is absolutely incredible, and she's done it in the worst possible circumstances, and she's doing it to make things better for others.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really think it was the horror of Americans being beheaded. It was just a horror. It took all that to wake up our country.
Yeah.
So it was, but so much to do.
And I do think that the presidential envoy means there's muscle memory. And actually, when you're engaging with the presidential envoy, they know about tactics that have worked in other cases. They know about what works in this particular country. They've got visibility on those issues. That simply doesn't happen. Look, I've been living and working on many of these cases for British prisoners in London over the last number of years. You may have seen some of the news about the revolving door of a variety of different prime ministers and a variety of different foreign secretaries. The Boris Johnson years the Liz Truss days. And it makes it very difficult because you're dealing with politicians who've just come in. They may have been only in office for 4 weeks. They just don't have any knowledge. And it is a huge, huge problem. But can I just mention something on the business side, Mark? I mentioned earlier Paul Rusesabagina, who, as many of you know, was kidnapped in UAE, in Dubai, and then brought to Rwanda. That was done on a private jet, which was European Union registered. It was a Greek private jet with a Greek crew. I, in the last number of years, have done 7 cases involving people being kidnapped on private jets in the UAE. And I think we need to start thinking about not just going after the aggressor states, who are the ultimate ones who are holding the political prisoners, be it Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and so on. We also need to start thinking about the bag carriers, the people who facilitate this happening. And at the moment, I am not seeing creative, coordinated solutions, or even solutions in any individual countries targeting the bag carriers. Why don't we target the private jet companies that are facilitating this? Why don't we target, for example, companies which are facilitating abuses which lead to mass incarceration of people simply for speaking truth to power in a range of places, including Hong Kong, for example? So we've got to get more creative. Our enemies are creative. It's time we got creative too.
Incredible.
That's well said. And I think these sort of facilitator issues are quite interesting because, of course, with the growth of ESG, the OECD principles, businesses are now having to include this as part of their obligations and to use such leverage as they have. I'd like now to open up to the audience and widen this discussion to include the panel as well. Madam, you come first.
Sorry, I jumped the gun.
No, fine.
Yes, you touched several times in several conversations about, doing deals with prisoners. So I wanted to ask you, in situations where it's, say, a U.S. national, European national held by an authoritarian regime on what are obviously trumped-up charges or whatever, what do you think about the prisoner exchange deals that are struck? Because often that's something that happens and is brought up and is being called for. And as you said, they don't do it until they do. Obviously, in an individual instance, it works, but it seems to create a larger problem because they know that that's a possibility. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
That's a really interesting question on incentives. Any other questions I can pick up? Yeah, maybe the mic could go over here while we answer that.
Sure. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism in the U.S. with that because of the concerns of incentivizing and such. But part of the problem is we have to, as Jared and Caitlin, we have to know what the captor will accept. I mean, the captor has an opinion, and they have a vote as part of the problem. And sometimes they have targeted someone with that in mind. So it becomes really tough, and at the same time you need to find ways to deter together, so that, because on the other hand, if you don't negotiate, like in the case with Jim, our government refused to talk to the captors, well then they were gone. I mean, so you go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the Mozzie cases, CMAC was one of a number of prisoners in exchange for $6 billion of Iranian funds that were actually now still, after October 7th, still frozen. It was their own money that was from an oil deal that had been frozen in South Korea before that was being traded for the American hostages. I mean, honestly, I feel these deals are horrific. I mean, there's just no other way to define it. And what was very, very interesting for me in advocacy over many years for the Mozzies, talking to Republicans and Democrats, is lots of people take the position they don't want to negotiate. And my own view is that we have to get the current group out before we can then disincentivize the hostage taking. And if people are going to say, well, we oppose any deal with Iran, for example, then they need to say to Baba Tamazi, the son and brother of the Tamazi family, and saying, I'm sorry, we've decided to sacrifice your family on the altar of being pure as the driven snow, and saying we don't talk to dictators or deal with dictators. The reality is that we have to talk to terrible people in order to get deals done. But the most important thing is it should be an impetus for solving the problem multilaterally in the kind of way I was describing. Because for all the Republicans that came out and criticized, and some Democrats, the hostage deal that got the CM Namazi and the others out, the presumption in criticizing it and saying it encourages hostage taking is that we're not going to change how we engage on these cases going forward, and we're going to continue to be consistently inconsistent. And undoubtedly, it does encourage hostage taking if we don't actually work multilaterally to create draconian disincentives for taking hostages. But if we can actually come together and do that, then we shouldn't have to pay another bill for this, because countries will realize they can't make money in the way that they used to do, and they'll probably move on to other things. But at least that would be resolved.
Yeah, so short term, in many cases, it does involve a deal, and that can sometimes be a prisoner exchange, and sometimes a creative one, like Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who was released from Iran, an Australian national. It involved the release of Iranian prisoners in another country, not in Australia, and that was a deal which was considered acceptable to the Australian government. And she is now home. But my colleague Tatiana Eatwell, brilliant lawyer who works on many of these cases and is known to some of you in the room, acted for Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who was imprisoned in Iran. And she and others, other British nationals who were imprisoned in Iran, were ultimately released only when a debt was paid. It was in fact a debt which the UK did owe Iran as a matter of international law, but they'd been withholding it. So many of these cases do involve some kind of deal making. It seems to me sometimes, though, you've got to create alternative leverage. And that's why I was talking, as well as the point that Jared's making, with which I completely agree, about multilateral engagement. I also think creating leverage on areas which we know matter to the states who behave in this way. So the aggressor states who behave in this way often care about their reputation. They do actually want to present themselves as a place where they can be a seat of arbitration. It's safe for people to invest there, for example. And we've got to think about ways of leveraging that too. Because at the moment, because we're not doing that, often the only deal on the table is set on the terms of the captor. And we need to start setting deals ourselves.
I think this is a really interesting point, actually, because if it's an interstate problem and you've got the intransigence, we don't deal with terrorists, which of course we know is bunkum anyway, but you know, if you can get corporate or other leverage put in, you know, so look at the supply chain. Is there a taint in the supply chain from these jurisdictions?
Mark, can I give one example, actually, that's just been occurring to me during this discussion? Many of the discussions we're having are about states who have skin in the game when you're dealing with a dual national. So where, for example, you have an American prisoner who's detained in Iran. One of the hardest types of cases that I do are the cases where it's a political prisoner and they don't have dual nationality. And it's very hard to get states to care, frankly. So I'll give you one practical example. Aras Amari was a cultural rights worker working for the British Council, and she was imprisoned in Iran. Not a UK national, she was a UK resident, so she was just Iranian. So it meant in terms of UK priorities, she's right down the bottom of the list, because obviously their focus is on UK nationals imprisoned in Iran. And it was a cultural rights case, so you don't have the same network that you have, for example, when a journalist is detained. Really hard to get people like UNESCO or the European Union network on cultural institutions to kick into gear. They're just not used to dealing with it. So we had to work out a strategy, and we worked out the best way to do it was to find a way to make a key state have skin in the game. And the answer to that was Germany, because Germany, in the Goethe Institute, has a huge number of cultural rights workers based in Tehran who travel all the time between Germany and Tehran. So we went to Germany to say, look, if they can treat this cultural rights worker in this way, I mean, what she was doing was bringing music and Persian poetry to the UK and bringing British poetry and music to Iran. It was called cultural penetration, corruption on earth, and she got a sentence of over 10 years for it, astonishingly. But we got Germany to care about it. And Germany realised, actually, if this woman who was doing work with the cultural ministry in Iran, which was apparently completely fine, there was proper engagement with the cultural ministry, was picked up in this way, that could happen to any one of the 500 staff that we've got there. And Germany is also a state that's got high trade links with Iran, continues to negotiate, has got good diplomatic relations. So that's how you have to do it when you're dealing with a case like that. Or indeed Tumaj Salehi this week, the rapper, again, just an Iranian national, and we managed to get great support from a very wide range of people, including Sting, Margaret Atwood, Coldplay, a whole range of people. And actually what we also had to do was try to get support within country to put political pressure on the regime within Iran. But they're the hardest cases. And the multinational system that we're discussing One of the key challenges I see with that is how do you get those states to care about people who are not their own nationals, because they're often the most intractable cases.
Let me just quickly mention that this same kind of creativity is necessary at a multilateral level. When I was representing Aung San Suu Kyi, back when she was viewed quite differently from 2006 to 2010, when I got involved in her case, work on her case was all force and no vector. Everybody in their role was doing their own thing to help. And you need to focus in order to get somebody out. And so I went to all the NGOs that were working on Burma and human rights there and basically said, let's all work together. Everybody can take credit for it. But the idea I came up with, just off the top of my head, was how many former presidents and prime ministers can we get to sign a letter to Ban Ki-moon to press him to go to Burma to free all the political prisoners, including her. And we were able, across all of our collective networks, to get 112 former presidents and prime ministers to send a letter on one day to Ban Ki-moon. And 2 months later, he was the first sitting Secretary General of the UN to visit Burma. That was after 15 years of resolutions to the General Assembly, 15 years at the Commission on Human Rights and the Human Rights Council, and a totally intractable conflict. And from there, he appointed a special envoy on Myanmar, and ultimately, the country became free, and now, of course, it's back to being a dictatorship. But you literally have to make stuff up in order to create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist.
It's great that you're sharing this playbook. Shall we go here? And if somebody else wants to come in, thank you. You'll come next.
Hello. I was going to ask a question about jurisdiction, but Keelan, I think you just answered it. So I'd also like to ask, how, as you said that this is a narrow field within the international law practice, did both of you begin your practice, or how did you come to practice this type of law, since it is relatively rare, though much in need?
Just briefly, I went to law school to become a human rights lawyer after being involved in a protest against the Chinese president who visited my campus when I was getting my public policy degree. And I freed my first political prisoner actually as a law student. I was on an externship in London, read about this case of this British guy who'd been detained in Burma, and then tripped through a process of getting him out. And a lot of things came together the right way. And about 8 months, 9 months later, James Maudsley was released. This is in the fall of 2000. And I met him at the airport, and we did a press conference in front of like 30 journalists. So it was like front page news in the UK. And I was just hooked on the work. I mean, in the room right off of the runway after he landed, his mom introduced him to me and said, "James, this is Jared." And he said, "Thanks, you saved my life." And so I was totally inspired. And of course, I knew it was going to get much harder from there because I got a white guy out of a Burmese prison. And the real trick is getting a Burmese person out of a Burmese prison. But that was the beginning of my journey doing this work.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I think I'm sure all of you have had that experience, and any of you who are parents will have had that experience of children having the kind of "it's not fair" gene. So I definitely had rather a large dose of the "it's not fair" gene, and I was absolutely sure I wanted to do something that was social justice related. And then so I, like Jared, became a lawyer in order to do this kind of work. So that's what motivated me. Right. And it was partly these cases and partly accountability for crimes against journalists.
We're coming up to the end, so I'll take one last question, if I may.
Yes, thank you so much. I just recently became aware of the whole political prisoners in light of the Belarus case, and to the point of a lot of political prisoners are imprisoned by their own governments. And say in their case, you read about 1,400 political prisoners, and they don't really go up in numbers, but what's happening is that they're getting these short sentences, and actually over 10 years, you have, thousands and thousands of them. A little bit of a basic question, though. How do you actually retain your cases? How do you hear? How do the parents come to you? How do you get involved? And the second question, would you please comment on the State Department's what was it? Without Just Cause campaign and its effectiveness?
Thank you. You want to go first?
Well, just briefly in Belarus, I represent Ales Belyatsky, the Nobel Peace Laureate there, and there are more than 10,000 political prisoners in Belarus, and it is an impossibly tough case because everyone's focusing on Russia and not on Lukashenko. So I would just briefly note that. These cases come to me, I don't advertise, and these cases at this point now I get inquiries every week. My law firm spends 40% of its time doing pro bono work. We do the maximum amount that we can, but it's clearly not enough.
But I think I'm going to come to you, Diane, on the other point about the organization. But there is something here which is often I see lawyers learning on the job. Everybody's very well-meaning, but actually it is such a specialist area, it isn't something that you can do just off the cuff. And it is important to get properly trained by like these two guys. Diane, did you want to say something?
Well, the only thing I was going to add is that's where I think a lot of the international community, we're really fortunate. The current United States Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs has straddled both administrations, which has given him a lot of muscle memory. He's become very good in he's built an amazing department. And therefore, you know, I'm just so grateful. I think that's what internationally is needed. You know, governments need to see this as enough of a national security threat that they want to invest in some people really developing that kind of expertise. Then they can work with, instead of, there aren't enough of these people, Keelan and Jared, there really aren't.
We're running out of time, so quick.
Yeah, sure. So people come to me because of my expertise in the field. It's an expertise I would like not to have, because I would like this problem not to exist. But as long as it exists, I'm going to keep doing these cases and keep fighting to get people out. A key thing that keeps happening at the moment is that states are unwilling to comment when you have prisoners who are held on remand. Now, that's a real problem, because we're now seeing it as a tactic. People are held on remand for 3-4 years. In Hong Kong, for example, you've got a huge number of people, vast majority of whom are aged under 30, and some of whom are aged under 18, who are political prisoners who've been held for more than 2 years without their case coming to trial. Now, and if states maintain this veneer of saying, we can't possibly comment on these cases until the trial process has concluded, what that does is it condemns a huge range of people to remain political prisoners. So it's now time that states accept that when you're dealing with a country which is not rule of law compliant, you need to call out the behaviour early. And a practical example of that, Sebastian Lai had to fight for his father, a British national, to be supported by his own government. And it took until almost the 3rd anniversary of his father being in prison before a British Foreign Secretary called for his father's release. That's a disgrace, not good enough, it's got to change.
And if there's an interest in this, if we tickle your fancy, as it were, do come along tomorrow and listen to Sebastian and Jose talk about their fathers and the problems that they've faced. But I think I want to thank this wonderful panel, but it does seem to me we've got some really solid takeaways, including, you know, there needs to be a hostage affairs person, an apolitical person in every democratic government if they're going to work together. There needs to be that muscle memory institutionally as well as amongst the lawyers. And I think also the role that I think we see for the future of business. And it's really interesting, just taking Hong Kong as a single example. At the moment, major banks are going out of Hong Kong. They're leaving rep offices, but it's no longer the centre. You've got the New York Times, who's moved to Bangkok. Businesses are voting quietly with their feet. And interestingly, lawyers, the disputes are going to Singapore and to Dubai because they no longer trust the system for the rule of law in Hong Kong. And if just to emphasize that, you see that with multiple judges quietly withdrawing from the highest court in Hong Kong. They appoint a lot of foreign judges to sit there because it gives them legitimacy. Even those judges won't sit there anymore. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please thank this quite wonderful panel, Diane, Jared and Keelan.